أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من الشرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت. Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, friends and strangers watching this video on YouTube. And the topic today that I want to deal with is right there in the background. You can see the verse from the Holy Quran that refers to a people called Gog and Magog. And this is not going to be a historical discussion. Well, it will be partially historical, but this is a discussion in which I want to relate the topic to present times. And if you followed the news in recent days, what you would have seen is an extreme focus on preparations for an attack or for raising, beating the war drums against Russia. And what you will notice is that Russia has been hyped up as the boogeyman currently. And the boogeyman today, Russia, or Putin sometimes, is regarded as the biggest enemy of mankind. Is regarded as Hitler again, reincarnation of Hitler. And so what we see is an all too familiar scenario playing out, a media frenzy of all the major corporate-owned, Zionist-owned, capitalist-owned media houses in America, monopolized in about five companies, and also being transmitted further into their subsidiaries into smaller countries like South Africa and Australia and England and Europe and wherever. And the war drums are being beaten on all these networks, and we are being primed as the viewer for war. We are being put in a position where we will find war acceptable, or at least we will not object when there is war against the so-called boogeyman at the moment now, Putin. So the war drums are beating, but if you are old enough, if you are sort of in my age group or but older, then you will realize that it's nothing new. 10 years ago, we had the war drums beating against Muammar Gaddafi. We had the war drums. 10 years before that, we had the war drums beating against Saddam and his so-called nuclear weapons, which he didn't possess. And 10 years before that, you would have heard the war drums beating against Vietnam, whoever, Cuba, Iran, the Palestinians. And so every 10 years, constantly, and with no gap in between, we are being prepared and we are being psychologically primed to be ready for war, to accept it, to support it, or at the very least not to object against it. And what all these opportunities or these occasions on which the war drums were beaten, and all these occasions on which an invasion of a small country then ensued, and where destruction of that country then took place, like for example with Libya, where hundreds of years or decades of progress were just completely obliterated in 1 month. So we are primed, and then in retrospect we look back and we realize, well, tough luck. They destroyed Iraq, they destroyed Libya, they destroyed whoever, Venezuela, Cuba, wherever, Zimbabwe. And so we are always primed for war. So I want to discuss this question of Gog and Magog in the context of the times in which we live. We're living in a time of war, in a time of destruction, in a time of dispossession. Because the war is never just a war. The war is also accompanied by looting. So the artifacts of Baghdad of hundreds or 1,000 years back, the looting of those artifacts, the looting of the gold of Libya, the looting of the gold of Venezuela. So we know that there's $50 billion worth of gold that has been looted by Britain of the Venezuelan people now. And the looting of billions and billions of dollars of funds of Iran in the West. So the war, the invasion, the war drums, the destruction are all accompanied by a grand theft of the national treasure of that country. And I want to today put it a bit more in context for you. Because to just observe and to be a naive bystander is not good enough for us as agents of the divine, for us as agents of the book, for us as agents of righteousness and justice. We are not allowed and we dare not become naive bystanders and observers. We have the duty, the obligation to play a defensive role, a righteous part in all of this criminality, and to become the agents of righteousness. Now, where do we link our role? You know, the Quran often refers to ancient stories. There's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's the story of Noah and his people. There's the story of Shu'aib and his people. There's the story of Pharaoh and his people. And so the stories go back into the mists of history. But the Quran also prospectively, the Quran also in a prophetic way offers us an opportunity to look forward. So instead of, in this case, looking back at the previous nations and at their crimes and at their struggles and at the role that the prophets and those who were righteous and who were the agents of God Almighty played, the Quran here offers us a prospective look, a prophetic look at what is still to happen in the future. Now I want to show you a verse here. This verse says, "They said, O Zulkarnain, the Gog and Magog people do great mischief on earth. Shall we then render thee tribute in order that thou mightest erect a barrier between us and them?" Now this story goes back about maybe 2,500 years. And the Jews at the time of the prophet, the Jewish tribes, whom the prophet was all too familiar with, they used to test his prophetic powers by coming to him with questions about stories and tales in their holy scriptures. And one of the stories and the tales that they found in their scriptures was the tale of Dhul Qarnayn. Now, Dhul Qarnayn is very, very commonly or broadly accepted as Alexander the Great. We're not 100% sure, but I'm going to go with that for now. Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the known world about 500 years before Christ. So in the time when the Jews were already a community, where Israel or Jerusalem was in existence. And so Zulkarnain, or Alexander the Great, conquers the known world as a righteous agent of God. And in the Quran, Zulkarnain is regarded in a positive light. And of course, we don't have records of Alexander the Great, and there's a lot of indictments against him, but I don't think the point of this discussion is that now. Let's assume it's Alexander the Great. And in the story, the Quran narrates, in reply to the questions of the Jews to the Prophet, well, if you are a prophet, tell us about Zulkarnain, the great conqueror that conquered the known world, 500 years ago. Or at that point, it was 1,000 years ago. And the Prophet gave them a fairly detailed explanation of Zulkarnain's expeditions. Not the Prophet gave him. The Wahi, the Quranic inspiration that came through the Prophet, then set out some of the story of Zulkarnain. But there's an aspect in the story that is relevant to us today. And that one aspect is the particular experience that Zulkarnain has in traveling to a remote outpost of his known kingdom or empire. And he travels to this furthest outpost, and he finds that beyond the mountains, beyond a range of mountains, far beyond the reach of civilized people at the time, Zulkarnain / Alexander the Great then discovers a people beyond the most distant mountains that wreaks terrible havoc when they cross the mountains or cross the valleys between the mountains, and then come and plunder and damage and hurt and kill and maim the people on the side of the mountains. And these people lodge a complaint with him, and they say, look, we are under your sovereignty, under your kingdom, and we seek your protection. We seek your protection from these people on the remote other side of these mountains. These are a people who are given to plunder, murder, and the worst type of atrocities, and we seek your protection. And this is the verse that refers to that particular incident. They said, O Zulkarnain, the Gog and Magog people do great mischief on earth. Shall we then render thee tribute, in order that thou mightest erect a barrier between us and them? But that is not the final story that I want to leave with you here. So what happens is that the grand emperor Alexander the Great, or Zulkarnain, and by the way, the word Karnain means he of the two horns. He of the two horns. Some people say it's he of the two eras, because Karn also means an age or an era or a century. My own understanding, humbly, that I want to offer is that the method that Alexander the Great used was the pincer format when they waged war, and his army would outflank the enemy by having the two. So if you look at it from the top, the army would have a pincer movement. The two sides of his army would envelop or surround the enemy, and it would appear like two horns. And so he of the army, he of the two-horned army, I would offer that explanation, and that is where the name Zulkarnain. I mean, there's no record of people wearing two horns. The Greeks never wore horns on their heads, so we can eliminate the idea of a king with horns. The Vikings didn't even wear horns, so that was just a figment of people's imagination. Maybe, some tribes somewhere wore horns, but I have no knowledge of any king in the Greek era or in the Roman era or even in the Persian era, because some people will say that it was a Persian king, Cyrus II. So the two horns also, I would say, is the two horns is the way the army, attacked. So then Zulqarnain is pleaded to by the people on this side of the mountains for protection against Gog and Magog. And what happens is that he actually successfully erects a very, very powerful barrier. In fact, the barrier is so powerful because it is constructed out of metal and lead. And it takes obviously months or even more than a year to construct, because these people actually assist and they cart in endless amounts of metal, and they erect a smelter, and they erect a massive a metal/concrete barrier. And this barrier stands. This barrier is erected. And this barrier stops the incursion of the Gog and Magog people. So it actually brings about a period of relative peace and respite from the assault of the Gog and Magog people. And the story continues, and he builds the barrier. But then the important part of this verse is this part here. The important part. He said, "This is a mercy from my Lord. But when the promise of my Lord comes to pass, he will make it into dust. And the promise of my Lord is true. On that day, we shall leave them to surge like waves on one another." This is the important part here. So, here the verse then goes on to say that Alexander the Great, Zulqarnain, he brings peace, erects a massive steel structure in the valley between the two mountains, where the Gog and Magog people are unable to cross over. And then this barrier manages or stands the test of an extremely long time, but not eternity. So this barrier, the key point here is in these verses, is that the barrier does erode, because it says it turns to dust. He will make it into dust. And the promise of my Lord is true. So the barrier does erode over the centuries. And the barrier, when it does erode finally, when the barrier erodes, on that day we shall leave them to surge like waves on one another. The Gog and Magog people will surge, and they will cross the barrier, and they will spread the mischief. Remember, what I'm telling you here is not thumb sucking, it's not speculation. I am going to the roots of my philosophy of life, which is the book, the Divine Testament, and I'm drawing out from these verses something that is of benefit to me in present times. So the fact that the barrier is unable to withstand the test of many, many centuries is a problem. Because when those centuries pass by and that barrier slowly erodes and the metal becomes brittle and some of the concrete turns to dust, then the Gog and Magog people are able to breach that barrier. But if you think one verse is not enough to draw that, let me show you another verse. And here this verse says, listen to this verse. وَحَرَّمَ عَلَى قَرْيَةٍ أَهْلَكْنَاهَا أَنَّهُمْ لَا يَرْجِعُونَ. Allah, God Almighty, says in this verse that we made it haram for any country, for any nation to become great again, to acquire greatness again, once we've put them down, once we've brought destruction to them. So here's an important point in the Quran. Those who say that the Greeks will come again, or the Romans will come again, or the Arabs, the whoever. I want to point you to this: when a nation has been destroyed and devastated by Almighty God, Allah, they will not rise again. وحرم على قرية أهلكناها أنهم لا يرجعون. They will not rise again. Let's look at the next verse, yeah. حتى إذا فتحت يأجوج ومأجوج. Until, now Yusuf Ali, this is the Yusuf Ali translated, he translates فتحت as until Gog and Magog are let through. So this is another verse now. So Yusuf Ali says that when that barrier is eroded, the barrier between the mountains that barred the Gog and Magog people. Here the word Gog and Magog is again used in the Quran. When that barrier erodes, then Gog and Magog are let through the barrier, and they swiftly swarm from every hill. I've given you two verses now that say the same thing. Is that, number one, the barrier was erected by Dhul Qarnayn, we assume being Alexander the Great. In other words, Dhul Qarnayn went and established a barrier 500 BC, which lasted maybe, I'll tell you now, for several centuries. Now, let's continue the discussion. Gog and Magog have been confined, they've been kept behind the barrier, but at a certain point in time they breach the barrier has become eroded, and they are able to swarm from every high point. So they flood, they come in swarms, they come in waves. That's how the Quran explains it. They come in waves, and they swarm, and they afflict mankind with the plunder and the violence and the misery. Now I want to fill in some of the blanks here for you, because the Quran doesn't fill in sometimes the blanks, and it leaves it to us to shape the meaning in terms of what we observe with our eyes and ears. A very interesting thing happened in the 12th or 13th century. I think in the 1100s. No, so it's the 12th century. Something very interesting happened. 1200s, around about there. At that very time, I think 30 years apart. Let me just quickly get the right number in my head. 1270. Yeah, I think it's 1200. You can Google it. Two invasions took place on two different sides of the world. In Europe, an invasion of England, of what we call that time the English people, the Angles, because the English people were a Germanic people. They were a German, originally from sort of German stock, was invaded by a Nordic, by what is referred to today as the Northmen, or at that time the Northmen. The Northmen had always been regarded as a mischievous and a terrible people that had visited destruction, plunder, misery on the world before then. So in the 11th century and in the 10th century, the Northmen were called the terrible Northmen, and they were the ones that came and destroyed churches, that raped and plundered and destroyed and vandalized England or France or wherever they went. And the Christians were the prime victims and targets of the Northmen. In the 1200s, those Northmen who had nominally accepted Christianity and given some land in Europe under one of the leaders, Rollo, made a successful crossing of the English Channel and took possession of the land of the Angles of England. So the Northmen spread their presence from Europe onto the island of Great Britain. That happened in the 1200s. But at the very same time, almost at the same time, so a mischievous, barbaric, plundering nation, some people, the word Vikings, I use the word Viking, in fact, means plunderer or plundering. The Vikings take ownership of England, and more towards the east, Baghdad, the civilized Muslim world, is effectively overtaken by the Seljuk Turks, which is also a band of wild people coming out of the mountains or deep beyond the mountains of Asia Minor. So at the same time, these people are invading the east and the west. Now, like I said, I'm going to fill in the blanks here, but I'm not speculating on my own here. So what the deduction I'm drawing is that towards the 1200s, in other words, 1,700 years after Alexander the Great constructed the Great Barrier for the wild people beyond the mountains, the people of Gog and Magog, those barriers were breached somewhere in the 1200s. And those people invaded and conquered and took possession of England and took possession of parts of Europe. In fact, there's still a province in France called Normandy. It comes from the word Northman, Normandy. And the King of England from that date is the same lineage that we have today. So the same William the Conqueror, who is a descendant of the Vikings, William the Conqueror, who crosses the English Channel, who invades England, who takes ownership of England, who takes the wealth of all the English aristocracy and turns England into his private own domain. That same William the Conqueror establishes a lineage, a dynasty, that if you trace it back, it will go back all the way to the present times. There were many houses within that lineage, but basically it's the same original invaders, offspring and descendants. The same on the east. When the Muslim heartland is invaded by the Seljuk Turks, it brings an end to the traditional rule of the Abbasids and the time of scholarship and the time of rational thinking and the time of science and scientific progress. It stops all scientific progress and it turns the Muslim caliphate into a pure force for invasion and self gratification and opulence and greed. So the Seljuk Turks transforms the way that the Muslim world functions. Still keeps the trappings of Islam, still keeps the Salah, but just takes out the spiritual depth out of the religion. In the East, the same thing happens. Still Christianity, but now it's a Christianity without the feeling of Christianity. It now becomes, the focus now is on accumulation and on plunder and on accumulation and on enrichment, self-enrichment. So I want to then, to offer you that explanation that the Gog and Magog people are the people that breached the barrier in the 13th century and that changed the nature of the Muslim world and changed the nature of the Christian world also. Europe and Asia Minor, all affected by the invasion of these tribes that swarmed once the barrier was eroded. So now I'm coming back to the present. In present times, we find an organization called, lo and behold, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Who's a member of NATO? Believe it or not, the Seljuk Turks. Turkey is a member of NATO. And, very, very importantly, Britain and all the other minions and America, North America. So NATO today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, refuses to take in any Christian power like Russia, refuses to take in any Muslim power, because Turkey is no longer a Muslim power. Turkey is a secular country. So this very NATO now becomes the incarnation of the northern savages from the east and from the west. The northern savages that combine under one umbrella called the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And who is the heart and soul of NATO? It's America and Britain. When I read the news today, I read that they are beating the war drums. NATO, America and Britain, the two manifestations of barbarism and savagery. They are beating the war drums against Russia. They are boycotting some Olympics in China because they are feeling bad for the Muslims of China. What a ridiculous thing. How ridiculous is that? Even as they are bombing weddings and funerals of Muslims in Afghanistan, in Yemen, do they express their sorrow at the Muslims of China, which is pure image deception and creating a false narrative. So I want to leave you with this today, and I will continue because it's going to be a very long video, so I will continue next time. That you need to understand the Quran. When the Quran speaks about the Gog and Magog, it refers to none else than the North Atlantic Alliance, the alliance of savages that breached the wall built by Alexander the Great, that invaded the civilized Christian world and the civilized Muslim world and transformed it into their image and co-opted all of us, you and me. Because the sad thing is, we've all been co-opted without us knowing. Our Islam, our Christianity is no longer the religion of Jesus or the religion of Muhammad. It is now the religion of accumulation, of plunder. I plunder. My business is not a place where I serve God. It's a place where I try and make as much money as possible. My profession, if I'm a teacher, it's not to teach children, it's to earn a salary. So effectively what we have done is we've displaced conscience. Because the difference between the barbaric savage and the noble man or the decent human being is the absence of a conscience. And today I want you to look at, when you look at CNN, when you look at BBC, and you look at those people speaking there, they come across as reasonable. But the one thing you will not find in them is a conscience. There is no conscience in them. They've killed off any inkling of a conscience. And what is a conscience? A conscience is an inner voice. In the Quran, the word that is used is taqwa. The word that is used in the Quran is dhikr. and taqwa. It is the inner voice of temperance, the inner voice of guilt. And the one thing that the Northmen, with their beautiful polished white teeth and with their beautiful ironed suits and with their perfect smiles and their perfect hairdos, do not have is a conscience. And so we, the people of righteousness, whether you are Christian or a Muslim, whether you follow the Jesus, whether you are want to uphold the righteousness as Jesus brought it, or as Muhammad or as Moses brought it, the one thing we have in common with each other is that we have a conscience. We feel bad for those who are killed and maimed. The Northmen, the savage Britain, and the savage American, and the savage European have no conscience for the dead and the maimed and those who are the victims of war. And yes, I want to exclude the non-savage element, because I know a lot of British people. I mean, I've studied under, British teachers and English people, and I have English-speaking neighbors. I'm looking at one of the houses right now. I'm not looking at savages. I'm looking at decent people. But what I do see is that the conscience has been eroded. And so as long as they have, life is okay, they're okay. But the conscience has been eroded. And that goes for my Muslim neighbor on this side also. So let me finish off there. I want to discuss next time. I want to go into more detail about what is the mindset of the barbarian Northman. What is the mindset? Because I wrote a thesis on the Western mindset. I wrote a thesis about it. I studied it. I looked at what goes on in the mind of a Westerner. And by Westerner, I'm not saying a white person. I mean a Westerner is like, I could be a Westerner also. In fact, I am a Westerner in many ways. But what goes on in the mindset of the colonizer, the usurper, the thieving, usurping Western mindset? And hopefully, inshallah, if Allah allows me, I will visit that topic next time and show you what is the mindset of Gog and Magog. What makes Gog and Magog so savage? And how do we, in our time, the incarnation of Gog and Magog, namely NATO, America, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, the 5 Anglo and Canada, the 5 Anglophone countries, being the head of the beast. How do we confront, and with the grace of the Almighty Allah, how do we eliminate the head of the beast? So I will stop there and continue at another time.